Hello, everyone, and welcome back. Uh, Today, we're going to kind of do something a little different in our lecture. Apologize for the last one being broken up into four parts, the one on the civil rights movement. Unfortunately, I had some technical difficulties and had to switch over to a different software program to record my lecture, and I could only do it in like 15-minute blocks. So I apologize for kind of the truncated nature of that, the choppiness of that. But today we're kind of back to normal. But we're going to kind of pick up from where we left off last time, right? The civil rights lecture I did kind of cover this growing wave of kind of change that was coming really for decades, almost 100 years since the end of the Civil War. But it's really picking up steam here in post-World War II America, right? Again, as in the last lecture, I tried to point out that it never really stopped African Americans trying to push for equality, trying to dismantle these Jim Crow laws, right? People like Thurgood Marshall constantly challenging these Jim Crow laws. But it wasn't until World War II that real change started to happen. And that change is going to continue here in the 1960s. The 1960s is very much going to be a polarizing decade. I know today it's very common to hear those terms kind of thrown around in our lexicon today. And it's true, we are a very polarized society, but it didn't start today, right? A lot of the problems we have in our modern society of right versus left politics, of kind of social change versus social tradition, right? It goes back to the 1920s, but it really emerges again for the first time since the 1920s here in the 1960s, right? This affluence, this growing American economy is making it possible for a lot of people to kind of look at a lot of issues for the first time in a long time. They're not worried about where their next paycheck's coming from. They're not worried about the America's place in the world. By the 1960s, a lot of people understand we are the world's greatest power now, right? Now, true, we have some threats. We're worried about things out there, especially the Soviet Union and communism. But a lot of Americans are starting to feel like we can take on those challenges, that we are the greatest nation in the world. So here in the 1960s, a lot of things kind of come to a head. A lot of competition and competing factors in American life kind of come to the forefront. A lot of Americans are saying, hey, wait a minute, we're going around in the world talking about fighting for freedom, right? The four freedoms of World War II that have morphed kind of now into this crusade against communism and containment. And yet there are whole bunches of people in the United States that aren't truly free. Right? A lot of African Americans can't vote. Many African Americans aren't treated the same legally as white Americans. And it's not just African Americans, other groups, right? And in Los Angeles, as we saw in World War II, the Zoot Suit riots, a lot of people treated differently, right? Hispanic Americans not given the same freedoms. Even in places like Texas, there are Mexican-only schools. Hispanic people can't have certain jobs, can't go to certain businesses. So these are kind of dichotomous things, right? These are things that just seem incongruous, right? You can't be about freedom and yet not give freedom to a lot of people, right? So in the 1960s, a lot of this comes to a head, right? You've got families in the 1960s sitting around TVs. Their kids are watching the news with their parents, and they see things like the death of Emmett Till, and they say, why did this 14-year-old kid, he's my age, why did he have to die? And parents don't have a good answer for them, right? They can't explain it. Emmett Till died because he was black, right? There's no other way to explain it. It was simply a racial issue. So here in the 1960s, a lot of unpleasant conversations are starting, and yet there's a lot of pushback from other sides. A lot of people saying, look, we are the United States. We do stand for freedom. We have to oppose communism, or else we'll lose all freedom for everybody. And there's some truth to that as well, right? The Soviet Union crushes Hungary in 1956 when they try to become a little more democratic. They're going to do the same thing to Czechoslovakia in 1968. So the communists are a danger. They are a threat. There is truth to what's being said about the dangers of communism. But at the same time, the other side has a point that the United States is being hypocritical. We talk about freedom, and yet whole swaths of American society don't have freedom. So again, these become huge discussions here in the 1960s. And again, it kind of ties into this idea of what American stand for, right? What Americans stand for, what the nation's about, and how we're going to go about defending those ideas, right? So in a big way here at the beginning of this lecture, we're going to kind of turn back to the Cold War. We're going to look at how the next presidents after Eisenhower deal with containing communism and dealing with this challenge to American supremacy in the world, right? And we'll turn our attention to John Kennedy, the next president after Eisenhower, and then his successor, Lyndon Johnson, and what their ideas are for kind of dealing with communism and the international order, as it were, right? And that is something I kind of want to turn my attention to really quickly. It's something I want you to kind of understand. When Kennedy runs for office in 1960, he is very much about fighting the Cold War. That is where his attention is. He is not thinking about all these domestic issues that I just mentioned, right? Things like the civil rights movement, as I'll explain in a few minutes. He very much wants to be a Cold Warrior, is what we would call him, right? Somebody who wants to stand up to the Russians and get them to back down and take control of them, right? To make sure that the United States' kind of supremacy in the world is guaranteed. And that is really what a lot of Americans are kind of focused on here in the 1960s. Again, we're a more affluent nation than we ever have been before. Most Americans have a home now. Not all, but many Americans have their own home. They have a lot of creature comforts like, consumer items. Things like TVs are now ubiquitous. Cars are now in almost every home in the United States. So a lot of Americans, especially white Americans, are having a pretty good economic life right now. But again, they're being bombarded with these ideas of what it means to be an American, how Americans should act kind of through cultural mediums, right? Things like TV shows. But at the same time on the news, they're getting hit by all these kind of mixed messages. In different parts of the world, the United States is fighting to stop communism, trying to defend American way of life and our allies. But at the same time, we see things like the Montgomery bus boycott happening, the death of Emmett Till being covered on TV. And it kind of makes these conversations amongst the family kind of difficult, right? Where are we going here? What is this country about? What do we stand for? So in 1960, that question kind of has to be answered. We have a presidential election. The Republican Party puts out the man on the right, Richard Nixon, the current vice president of the United States under Dwight Eisenhower. He runs as a former congressman from California, now a vice president, to keep the Republican Party in power. And remember, Eisenhower is the first president since 1932 of the Republican Party. For 20 years, Roosevelt and then Truman ran the country for the Democratic Party. So the Republicans really want to keep control here. They want to keep control of kind of their version of containment and to keep kind of this consumer economy growing and everything else. So even though Kennedy and Nixon are about the same age, Nixon kind of portrays himself as a kind of the establishment figure, for lack of a better term, right? That he's a guy that Americans are very familiar with. He's been around for a long time now. He's been vice president for 8 years. He's very familiar to a lot of Americans. And also he seems very old, right? Again, he's been around for a long time. A lot of Americans know him. And that's what makes his competitor, who's actually the same basic age as Nixon, John Kennedy, seem so attractive. First of all, he is an attractive man. He's very charismatic. He has a great speaking style to him. He's handsome. He has a young family. In a lot of ways, Kennedy, even though he's from the same generation Nixon is, really represents this new America that's emerging after World War II, where Nixon kind of represents kind of that older kind of, World War II generation, even though they're both the same age. In the end, Kennedy's going to be able to win a very narrow victory over Nixon, right? And the Democratic Party once again kind of takes control of the United States government. And it's going to be Kennedy that's going to get to decide what his version of containment's going to look like. What doctrine is he going to adhere to, right? Is he going to follow Truman's lead, or is he going to do more of what Eisenhower did, kind of turn to these more covert methods to kind of defend American interests in the world? So in 1960, Kennedy has some big things to deal with. He has to deal with the Soviet Union kind of pushing forward in technology beyond what the United States can do. The Soviet Union's put a satellite in space. The United States still hasn't answered by 1960. Kennedy's answer is going to be saying, look, let the Russians put a satellite in space, we'll put a man on the moon, right? So he says within the 1960s, we need to put an American on the moon to prove that our system's the best system. He starts saying that we need to defend our allies anywhere and everywhere. The threat to communism, as it's put out there, needs to be met by the United States everywhere. That he's going to send troops anywhere and everywhere, just like Truman said he would. So here in his inaugural speech, Kennedy's really telling Americans he's going to focus on these foreign issues, all right, these foreign relations matters. That's where his real interest is. And as a matter of fact, in one part of his speech that a lot of Americans kind of take for a big kind of inspirational moment, where he challenges Americans, don't ask what your country can do for you, ask for what you can do for your country. A lot of Americans like that because it sounds like, hey, yeah, that's patriotism, right? We're going to stand up and defend our country. But he's also saying something else. Remember, when he's inaugurated, there are students, black students, white students, sitting in lunch counters all across the country protesting segregation, right? Saying, hey, look, we need to be able to treat everybody the same. People should be able to go and sit down at a restaurant anywhere, regardless of the color of their skin. That's what equality means. Well, Kennedy very much is saying in his speech, don't ask the government to get involved in this. You shouldn't be causing problems. That makes us look bad on the world stage. It makes people question what the United States is all about. You should rally around the government, support the government, regardless of whether you like things that are going on in your life. So in a big way, Kennedy wants to focus on these bigger issues, and he wants to kind of ignore the civil rights movement as it's emerging here in this country. He really doesn't have a lot to say about what he's going to do for African Americans or any other group in the United States that feels like they don't have the freedoms that this country is supposed to be all about. Rather, Kennedy's talking about sending American troops to countries like South Vietnam, a place most Americans have never actually even heard of, right? So Kennedy very much is focusing on the Cold War. And within just a couple months of becoming president, he actually gives a speech in Berlin, this divided city in a divided Europe, that really kind of culminates his idea. When he goes to Berlin in April or March of 1961, he tells people, look, the reason I'm here is because of what Russia's just done. They've built a wall dividing the city of Berlin, not to protect them from us, but to trap their own people in East Berlin, right? And he has a point. Up until 1961, more than 3 million people in Eastern Europe, the part of Europe dominated by the Soviet Union, have fled to the West through West Berlin, right? This sea of freedom in the Soviet zone of occupation of post-World War II Europe. When the Russians build this wall that's encircling West Berlin and trapping Americans and the Allies in West Berlin, they cut down on the number of people that are going to be able to escape out of their zone, right? And Kennedy calls out the Russians on this. In his speech, Ich bin ein Berliner, right, in front of the Berlin Wall, he says, look, we're all here together, right? The United States is here to defend Germany, to defend freedom. The United States is the country of freedom. We don't build walls to trap our people in, right? That's something communists do because they're prison states, is what he's implying, right? Now, of course, people across the world love this message. Kennedy says the United States is going to be there for you. We're going to defend people in Berlin. We're going to defend people in South Vietnam. We're going to defend people anywhere that are under the threat of communism. So he's very much turning back kind of to the Truman Doctrine, right? To kind of standing up to the Russians wherever the communism may pop up, right? And saying the United States will oppose communism wherever it's at. And of course, the international order loves this, right? Our allies in Europe love this, and a lot of Americans like this as well. This is the fight that needs to be fought. This is the enemy we need to stand up to. And again, it kind of takes away from all these bad things, these kind of hypocritical issues that we have in our society, where we're fighting for freedom on one side, but a bunch of Americans say they don't have that freedom at home. But right after Kennedy has this speech in Berlin in March of 1961, something else happens, right? There's something about communism that comes a lot closer to home for the United States, what a lot of historians have called communism next door. Here in 1961, the United States is about to be embroiled in a controversy, a confrontation with a country called Cuba. Now, Cuba is not an unfamiliar territory to the United States. In 1898, we went to war with Spain to help Cuba gain its independence from the Spanish Empire. But we never actually allowed Cuba to have full independence. The United States really dominated Cuba for decades. We told them how to run their government, who should be in their government, and that continued all the way up into the 1950s. As a matter of fact, in the late 1950s, under the Eisenhower administration, Eisenhower's government was funding the Batista government. They had chosen the guy by the name of Fulgencio Batista as the leader of Cuba, and they had funneled a lot of money and military supplies to him for him to keep control of that island nation. And he was very corrupt. He and his family members and his supporters stole a lot of that money, took a lot of the wealth of Cuba and kept it for themselves and their private interests. And a lot of people in Cuba saw the Fulgencio Batista government as corrupt and foreign, right? As dominated by the United States. He's not really looking out for us Cubans. We don't like him. So a lot of people rose up against the Batista government in the 1950s, right? By 1956, 1957, there are whole groups of Cubans fighting against the Batista government. Slowly but surely, with American military aid, though, Batista's able to defeat almost all of them by 1959. He thinks that pretty much Cuba's back under his control. There's only one group, however, that he hasn't got complete control of, and it's run by a young revolutionary by the name of Fidel Castro. He's hiding in the mountains of Cuba. He's getting support from other revolutionaries in Latin America and, by extension, from the Soviet Union. Eventually, he trains enough soldiers, he finds enough support in a lot of Cubans that are upset about what's happening in Cuba, that he decides to launch an attack on the Cuban government, the Batista government, and starts winning. Pretty soon, Castro is starting to take over parts of Cuba. The Batista government's in trouble. People rise up against him when they see that Batista's weak, and pretty soon he, his family, his supporters have to flee to the United States. This guy, Fidel Castro, has now taken over Cuba. Now, at first, the United States government doesn't have an official position here. They're willing to kind of let this play out because otherwise it'll look like the United States is controlling Cuba the way the Soviet Union controls countries in Eastern Europe. So Castro is kind of left to do what he wants. But pretty quickly, it appears Castro's policies are communist policies. He starts nationalizing businesses. Remember, American businesses dominate Cuba to the tune of about half of Cuba's economy is actually owned and operated by the United States businesses, right? So Cuba, under Castro's leadership, starts taking over all these businesses, starts nationalizing all those companies, starts taking the wealth and starting dispersing it to the people of Cuba. Very communist policies. Eventually, he announces himself to be a communist. So here in 1961, things get pretty scary, right? A lot of people think, hey, we just had a communist revolution take over Cuba. Cuba's 90 miles from the United States, from southern Florida. We better do something. Well, the Eisenhower administration had already been planning on this. They had been training a lot of Cubans who had started fleeing Cuba in 1959 as Castro's forces started to push forward. And now in 1960, they'd really ramped up their training efforts. All throughout Florida, there were secret CIA bases set up to train these Cuban exiles so they could go back, take over Cuba, and install a new government, or even bring Batista back if that's what they wanted. But they weren't ready to go by the time the elections held in 1960. The Eisenhower administration decides they can't authorize this. That's the next president's call to make. So when Kennedy becomes president, he has to decide, are we going to let this operation go? Are we going to send these Cuban exiles into Cuba to try and do a counter-revolution? Eventually, Kennedy says, let's go ahead and do it. But he changes the plan. Originally, the United States Navy and Air Force were going to help these exiles, these Cuban exiles, take their country over, right? But Kennedy decides that would look bad. It'd really look like the United States was doing this. We might as well just send in the U.S. military completely. And Kennedy says, no, they got to do it on their own. So they're not going to have any naval support. They're not going to have any air support from the United States government. These exiles really are on their own. And when these Cuban exiles trained by the CIA in the United States launched their invasion in April 17th, 1961, they find out that the Cuban people aren't interested in having another revolution. They're okay with Castro, at least for the time being. He's doing what they want him to do. And they turn against these exiles. That in the end, this landing, this invasion becomes a fiasco. Thousands of these exiles trained by the United States are captured by Castro's forces. This thing called the Bay of Pigs invasion becomes an immediate, huge failure. So Kennedy looks kind of bad here, right? He had a good moment at the Berlin Wall a few weeks earlier, and now things look kind of bad for him. It looks like maybe he doesn't have all the answers. Maybe the United States really can't deal with the expansion of communism the way it says it wants to, right? So all through 1961, Kennedy's trying to find a way to stand up to the Soviet Union. And this drags on into 1962. Because after the Bay of Pigs invasion, Castro is pretty sure the United States is going to try this again. So, of course, he turns to the one country he thinks he can count on for protection, and that's the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union decides, instead of sending troops like the United States would to protect its ally, that it'll do something else. It'll place nuclear weapons in Cuba. And because Cuba is so close to the United States, that means the United States, which doesn't have nuclear missiles that are this accurate as the Russians, right? Remember, the Russians have put a satellite in space. We can't do that. The Russians have better missiles right now in 1962. This scares the Kennedy administration. When American spy planes see these missile bases being created in Cuba, the United States realizes, hey, you know what? The Soviet Union could attack us, and there's not much we could do about it. They could destroy us before we could destroy them, which really kind of goes against what the Eisenhower administration had kind of based all of American policy on for the last 10 years. Mutually assured destruction. You attack us, we destroy you. Well, now the Russians might be able to attack us, and we might not be able to respond in any way, shape, or form. So for the Kennedy administration, this is a big deal. In 1962, they announce a blockade of Cuba. We're not going to allow any of these Russian missiles to show up. We're not going to allow Russia to put these bases in Cuba, and we're actually willing to go to war to make that point. So here in 1962, in about 13 days in October, it gets pretty scary. The president even goes on TV in middle of October to tell the American people, get ready. We might be at war over this, right? We're not going to allow Russian missiles to be pointed at us in Cuba. That we will sink Russian ships and kill Russian sailors if that's what it takes. Now, in the end, as Kennedy's kind of saying this to the American people, his administration is also quietly negotiating with the Soviet Union. Because it turns out we have missiles in Turkey right on the edge of the Soviet Union. So they're just kind of doing to us what we're already doing to them. And in the end, both sides decide to compromise. The Russians are going to pull back their missiles out of Cuba. We'll quietly dismantle our missiles in Turkey. And eventually we'll kind of all just kind of pull back from the brink here. But in a real way, for about 7 days or so, it looks like the world may go to war. Militaries, both in the United States and the Soviet Union, are gearing up for war, mobilizing, getting troops, weapons ready, right? They're ready to fight each other over this. Now, in the end, when the Russian ships turn around, it looks like Kennedy is the stronger guy here, right? He gets a public relations win is the best way to look at this. He stood up to the Russians and they backed down. Now, in the end, both sides compromised, so nobody really backed down here. Both sides got something out of this. But Kennedy's able to play it off as a big foreign relations win, right? That he stood up, he was tough on the communists, and he's back in charge, if you will. So a lot of Americans kind of respond to his leadership in a very positive way. And it's after the Cuban Missile Crisis that Kennedy starts kind of noticing that, the international rhetoric has to match the domestic message as well, right? Internationally, we're talking about freedom, defending people across the world. We're fighting in places like South Vietnam now, where there's about 15,000 American troops trying to help defend South Vietnam from communist forces in the north. And Kennedy's saying, we need to do something about all this, right? The March on Washington happened in August of 1963. In Birmingham in May of 1963, Kennedy's realizing, look, we have to do something about these domestic issues. We can't just focus on these foreign relations issues. So by late 1963, as Kennedy's getting ready to run for re-election in 1964, he's mentioning that maybe we need to pull back a little bit on the world stage. Maybe we're not going to have as many troops in Vietnam. That he is talking about a civil rights bill to try and address some of these domestic issues. Once again, to make sure that we look good on the international scene, right? That we're not seeming like hypocrites talking about freedom on one side and denying it on the other. But of course, all that comes to a crashing halt in November 22nd, 1963, when Kennedy is assassinated in Dallas, Texas on a fundraising campaign tour, right? When he is assassinated, his successor, Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, now has to decide what to do next. And the biggest question Johnson is going to have to answer after Kennedy's death is what to do with the war in Vietnam. And I want you to take a look at this picture. This is a picture from early on in the war, I think 1963, 1964. Here we have some of these American advisors, as they're called. Again, about 15,000 troops in Vietnam now by 1963. But technically, they're there to just help the South Vietnamese learn how to defend themselves, how to conduct operations so that the North won't take control of the country. But if you look at this picture, you kind of see who's really in charge here. It's the American soldier that's calling in all the information. All the South Vietnamese troops are looking to the American soldier for guidance, right, for what to do next. They're smoking American cigarettes. They have American weapons. They're dressed in American uniforms. Really, this is America's war in 1963. And again, Kennedy had talked about maybe getting us out of it, but Johnson is going to have a very different way of looking at things. Just like Kennedy, Johnson wants to be seen as a cold warrior. He thinks that by fighting against communism abroad, it's going to allow him to address these domestic issues that Kennedy was just kind of coming to realize needed to be taken care of. So that leads us to a few questions here that I have for you, and most of them are pretty pretty simple, like this one. Just ask yourself, so this thing called the Vietnam War, did we win it or not? Now, I think most of us could say it's pretty obvious we didn't, right? It goes down as a loss for the United States. So that brings me to another question I want to ask you. If that's true, if the United States did lose Vietnam War, and I do think we lost that war, right? Every historian does believe that. How many battles did we lose, right? If you stop and think about it, to lose a war, it means you had to lose battles along the way, right? Well, how many major battles did we lose? Was it none? We lost only a couple, but they were the ones that really mattered. Did we lose a lot of battles, or did we lose everything in Vietnam? Well, the answer here is kind of surprising. We didn't lose any battles. We actually won almost everything, right? Definitely we did not lose any of the major battles of this war, whether it be Quai Son, the Tet Offensive, Landing Zone X. We could go through the long litany of battles here, right? The United States always wins these battles. So how do you lose a war when you win every battle? And the simple fact of the matter is, you just lose the will to fight. That's what happened to the British in the American Revolution, right? They just lost the will to keep fighting. It's the same thing that happened to a lot of countries in World War II. They just lost the will to keep fighting. Well, that's essentially what's going to happen to the United States here as well. And then there's one other thing we want to talk about about this conflict. It is one of the longest wars in our nation's history, right? The only one that's longer is the one that's still going on in Afghanistan as of the creation of this video. And in such a long battle, right, such a long war, you're going to see a lot of casualties. The United States is going to lose somewhere on the order of 50 to 60,000 people, right, fighting in this war. So what were the losses like for the North Vietnamese? Heck, let's just generalize it even more for all Vietnamese, North and South. Do they lose about the same number of people as us, or more or less? And the reality is they lose more, way more. Somewhere on the order of between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese are going to die, both from the North and the South, in this war. Many of them killed by the United States, right? So the United States is by far and away going to be the biggest player in this war. We're going to do most of the fighting, especially from like 65 to about 1970. We'll be doing most of the killing, right? And of course, because most of this war is going to be fought in South Vietnam, the South Vietnamese are going to be the ones that are going to be doing a lot of the dying, right? But in the end, this is going to be a devastating conflict for Vietnam, right? In the end, about somewhere around 20% of the population is killed over the course of the 15 years this war runs. And then, of course, there's lingering effects felt even to this day, 50, 60 years after the war is over. So there's a lot to be looking at here, right, to go over. So what we have to kind of understand is why this war exists even in the first place, right? Well, the origins of this go much like Korea and a lot of the other parts of the world in the post-World War II era to what happened during World War II. This part of Southeast Asia, it was part of the French Empire in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. And when France is conquered by Germany in World War II, the Japanese step in and take over the French Empire in Asia. And what the Japanese find out is they have to use some pretty brutal tactics to keep control of Vietnam. The people of Vietnam weren't excited about being part of the French Empire. They were even less excited about being part of the Japanese Empire. And during World War II, a lot of Vietnamese, inspired by communist leaders like Ho Chi Minh and others, even followers of the old French Empire, right, fought against the Japanese. And they found a lot of help from the United States. Americans would ship them weapons and supplies. Those fighters against the Japanese in Vietnam would help downed American pilots or sailors that washed up on their shores get to freedom, stay away from the Japanese. So for a lot of Vietnamese, they were thinking that when the World War II ended and the Japanese were defeated, that this would be a chance for them to have their own country again, right? Vietnam had a proud heritage. It was a kind of an imperial country, had an emperor for a long time, and they were hoping that they could become an independent nation again. That had been a dream of theirs since World War I, actually. That's what Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communists, that's why he became a communist, because communists were dedicated to overthrowing the old imperial regimes in the early 20th century. So for a lot of Vietnamese, their identity was one of national identity, right? They wanted to be an independent country again, not dominated by the French, not dominated by the Japanese, or even the United States. So that's why they really were upset when the United States started helping France reclaim its empire in the 1940s and into the 1950s. And it led to a lot of Vietnamese fighting against the French. And eventually, by the early 1950s, the French decided to get out. They tried to hold on to this empire, and they found it was just too hard. They just didn't have the will for it anymore. They decided to give up. But for the United States, this was a scary moment because it looked like the communists were chasing people out of Southeast Asia. The Truman administration was talking about sending troops in. When the Eisenhower administration takes over, however, they say, look, we don't want to send U.S. soldiers there because who knows what will happen to them when they get there. Let's just build up the southern part of Vietnam, the part that was more controlled by the French, and try to get them to hold off the communist forces in the north. So for the Eisenhower administration, this was about the domino theory, about keeping Vietnam from falling, because then it would go to Cambodia, then it would go to Laos, then it would go to Thailand, then it would go to India, then it would go to Europe, right? So for the United States, this was about the Cold War. But for the Vietnamese, as I mentioned before, it was really about getting rid of foreigners. And the communists, being the leading anti-imperialist forces in Vietnam, they were able to get a lot of popular support, not because of their communist ideals, but because of their nationalist ideals. And it made it harder for the South Vietnamese to really kind of get a lot of people behind them because they were seen as being dominated first by the French, now by the Americans. So in the end, the United States was having to send in more and more support. Eventually, actual physical soldiers, right? The Kennedy administration undoes what the Eisenhower administration was saying and starts sending in American military personnel to help defend South Vietnam, to the tune of somewhere between 13,000 and 16,000 American soldiers are in Vietnam at the time of Kennedy's death. And when Kennedy dies, the next president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, has to decide what to do next. Kennedy said, maybe this is a mistake, pull the troops out. But Lyndon Johnson, again, wants to do some big things back at home in the United States. And the only way he thinks he can get support for his domestic agenda is by being a tough Cold Warrior. So he decides he's not going to be the guy that loses a country to communism. Instead, he starts sending massive support from the United States to South Vietnam, both for military training, for military equipment for the South, but then eventually just more and more troops. Within 2 years of becoming president in his own right, Johnson's got 400,000 American troops in Vietnam. By 1968, it's 500,000. The American planes bombing parts of South Vietnam and even parts of North Vietnam almost on a constant basis. Now, all through the mid-1960s, most Americans supported this. They thought, hey, look, we have to stand up to communism. We have to kind of make sure that freedom is defended anywhere and everywhere in the world, or else we could lose it here at home, right? Those ideas of the Cold War and even of World War II are really resonating with a lot of Americans. But then something happens in 1968. Even when a lot of Americans still thought, hey, the military says it's winning, we're killing a lot of the enemy, this war should be over soon, comes news of a massive attack by the communist forces of North Vietnam. It's called the Tet Offensive. It launches in early 1968, and pretty much by the summer of 1968, the North Vietnamese have overrun virtually every part of South Vietnam, including attacking the American embassy in Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. So here in 1968, it looks like the war is far from over, that victory is not just about to happen, that the Vietnamese, the communists, are fighting hard and actually bringing the war to us. Now, in the end, we crush the Vietnamese in this battle, this thing called the Tet Offensive. We kill a lot of North Vietnamese soldiers, right? But the South is also decimated by this fight, right? They got caught by surprise. A lot of South Vietnamese are killed in the fighting. And then comes news of something else. An American kind of analyst in the Pentagon, a man by the name of Richard Ellsberg, releases a bunch of papers. He had worked on a secret study for the U.S. Military in the 1960s. And he had gone to Vietnam several times working for the CIA. And basically what he did in this report was he said, look, we've known from day one that we're not going to win this thing, that we've been lying to Americans for almost 10 years now that this is a winnable war. It is far from winnable. Actually, we think we're losing because the North Vietnamese don't look like they're going to quit anytime soon, because it's not about ideology, it's about having a country. This becomes known as the Pentagon Papers. And between this Tet Offensive and the fact that this war looks like it's far from won, and then the news of these Pentagon Papers a few years later, sours most Americans on this war. In the end, this guy, Lyndon Johnson, knows something bad is happening here. And actually, Americans are getting hit with bad news all the time about this war. This picture, shown in homes throughout the United States. It's a brutal picture, right? What's going on here is an execution on the streets of South Vietnam during the Tet Offensive. But it very much sums up what seems to have gone wrong here in this war. Here are South Vietnamese soldiers on the left-hand side. They're searching for these Viet Cong, these infiltrators from the north who sneak into the South and cause trouble. We would today call them terrorists, right? Well, these South Vietnamese soldiers think they've found one of these North Vietnamese terrorists. But they haven't, they've arrested him, but they're not taking him to jail. He's not going to get a trial. They're executing him right there on the street for everybody to see. That is not what a lot of Americans think they're fighting for. When scenes like this keep coming along, when talk about what happens about the at the Vietnamese village of My Lai, right, where 250 South Vietnamese civilians are killed by American troops, it just looks like this war is out of control and that we're not the good guys that we think we are, right? That we're doing some pretty bad things here. And actually, as this war kind of spins out of control, even the president of the United States, Lyndon Johnson, realizes he's losing, right? This war is not going well for him in any way, shape, or form. And by early 1968, he's made a decision that he doesn't think he can even run for president again. He served part of Kennedy's term. Now he's going to be serving, he served one in his own right. He can easily run for office again, but he decides it's just not worth it. That in the end, this war is just comes with too much baggage. He's been on the wrong side. The American people don't trust him anymore, that he's just going to have to give up and go home. Leave what happens next to the next guy. But that is not the sense of defeat that's kind of starting to permeate the Lyndon Johnson administration isn't the only thing that Johnson's going to be known for, right? What's the Vietnam War is going to come to define his presidency. But something else he does is just as important, right? It's that domestic side that he was fighting the Vietnam War for, right? Again, kind of remember that Johnson was thinking, if I fight the Vietnam War, I'll get both Republican and Democratic support for me at home to do the things I think need to be done to fix the country, right? To make the country a better place, to answer some of these big problems. Because you see, Johnson, more than Kennedy, actually understood what the civil rights movement was really kind of all about. You see, Johnson grew up poor. Johnson understood what it was like to not have food, to not have a future, right? He had actually kind of born in West Texas. He had seen how Hispanic kids were treated differently, had to go to their own schools, that those schools didn't have good teachers because he was one of those teachers. He was at these what they were called Mexican-only schools, where there were poor infrastructure. There was no sometimes water for the kids, right? There were one room for several different grades. The teachers were poorly paid, poorly trained. And he understood that that meant that these kids with a poor education had a poor future. And that wasn't the same on the other side of town where the white families went to school. He saw what segregation was really like. And because he came from a poor family himself, he understood what it was like to be hungry. He understood the impact that that had on people's lives. So here, when Johnson becomes president, he's inspired by what happened in the United States in the 1930s with Roosevelt's New Deal. He understands that government can step in and make some big changes, that in the end, the federal government has so much power, so much wealth, that it can actually transform American society. And that's what he wants to do now that he's president after Kennedy's assassination. He has an idea here. He's going to call it the Great Society, that he's going to make America domestically everything that it says it is internationally, right? So here in 1963, when Johnson becomes president, he's going to start going about getting his way. And believe me, he's somebody who knows how to get his way. He's a hard-nosed politician. He knows how to get things done. He served in Congress, both in the House and the Senate for years, decades actually. So when he's president of the United States, he's able to really intimidate people and get what he wants. You can actually see it in these pictures on the right-hand side. In the top picture, he's talking with one of his press secretaries, one of his actual friends. Now, yeah, they're laughing and smiling, but look at what's happening here. Johnson, who's kind of a tall guy, a big guy, is trying to physically intimidate his friend, right? He's telling people who's the boss, right? It's called the Johnson treatment. He does it over and over again. He's crass, he's crude, he's rude, he's all these things because it intimidates people. It's hard for people to kind of deal with him so he can get his way. And what's amazing is he can use that tactic on politicians of both parties to get what he wants. And one of the first things he pushes for when he becomes president is a Civil Rights Act. He says, look, we do have to make things equal for everybody. We do have to make sure that people are treated the same, that all these Jim Crow laws need to go away. That in the end, there's only one thing, one entity that can make sure people are treated fairly, and that's the federal government. So he proposes in kind of Kennedy's honor that he said Kennedy wanted to do this. He just didn't get a chance to do it. He says, let's push for a Civil Rights Act. Let's ban discrimination, segregation in all public life. The federal government will make sure schools are the same for everybody. That everybody has the same opportunities for jobs, or else the federal government will step in and fix that, stop that discrimination. So it's a vast expansion of federal authority here that he's talking about in 1960s America, and it's not in the context of a war, it's in the context of a Cold War. That for us to really be this nation of freedom, we have to give freedom at home. Johnson understands that, and he wants to make that really happen because it'll make the United States look better on the world stage, and it'll kind of get rid of a lot of these problems internally in the United States. And what he finds is after the Civil Rights Act passes easily with votes from both Republicans and Democrats in 1964, that things aren't any better, right? It's kind of surprising to him that these protests, these civil rights protests, don't actually stop, they expand. Because he actually hasn't solved many of the problems. Just passing a law isn't enough. They have to be enforced. Things actually have to look and act differently. What happens is the next year, Selma, Alabama proves that not a whole lot has changed because of the Civil Rights Act. Under the leadership of people like Martin Luther King and other civil rights activists, African Americans throughout the South are still protesting Jim Crow and still protesting one of the biggest legacies of Jim Crow, the lack of voting rights for most African Americans. To kind of bring this to light, Martin Luther King and other civil rights leaders decide to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, about a 50-mile march or so in Alabama, one of the most segregated states in the United States. And there they're going to start in Selma and walk across a thing called the Edmund Pettus Bridge to walk to Montgomery, Alabama. Now, the governor of Alabama, George Wallace, and the local leaders of Selma, all white, have said, no, this isn't going to happen. When the marchers try to march, well, this happens. TV crews are there watching this massive civil rights protest, and they see Alabama state troopers, local police officers, sheriffs going around attacking peaceful protesters. This image is broadcast across the world, shown to everybody. And it's a great propaganda defeat for the United States. Here are a bunch of Americans, like the young man here in the lower center part of the picture. His name is John Lewis. He's now a congressman, just recently passed away in the United States Congress. He is being beaten. His skull is going to be fractured by a police officer simply because he was walking across this bridge. The governor and the local authorities said that these civil rights activists weren't allowed to have their demonstration. They decided to exercise their First Amendment right of peaceful assembly, and they are attacked, tear gas, beaten. Some people have broken arms, fractured skulls, broken ribs, broken legs. It is a pretty horrific scene, and it goes out across the world. So eventually, there's a second march. This one is not confronted by the police. This one's led by Martin Luther King and other white civil rights leaders who come in to kind of show solidarity, to kind of say, hey, look, you can't treat people like this. And now this march takes place. But it highlights to everybody that this civil rights movement isn't done yet, that more needs to happen. And that's an important point to make here. Why now, right? Why is the civil rights movement actually getting some things done now when it hasn't for 70, 80 years, right? Civil rights has been an issue in this country since Reconstruction. All through Reconstruction, Republicans and just a lot of people, blacks in the South, blacks in the North, whites in the South, have been pushing to try and make an equal society. They made things like the 14th and 15th Amendments realities to guarantee those rights, passed things like the 1868 Civil Rights Act, but all of it was undone with the end of Reconstruction. in the years that followed during Jim Crow, right? The NAACP tried to keep fighting back to try and get those rights restored. People like Francis Grimke in the 1920s had pushed for more advocacy from African Americans. And constantly these things failed. All through the 1930s, Jim Crow laws were challenged by people like Thurgood Marshall, and they failed. So why now? Why here in the 1950s and 60s are suddenly these things being addressed and taken on? Well, the Cold War is a big part of that answer. With the United States dedicating itself to saying we're fighting for freedom, it is hard to show things like the Edmund Pettus Bridge incident, right? And be able to reconcile those things. Here are African Americans peacefully protesting the right to vote, which the 15th Amendment says they have, right? And they're still living in a society that's segregated, even though the 14th Amendment and now the Civil Rights Act of 1964 all say those segregation laws are illegal, but yet they're still allowed to happen. So here in the 1950s and 60s, because of immediate media, things like radio and television, right? These powerful messages, images are going across not just the country, but the world. And the United States feels it has to act. That's why Kennedy's starting to get involved before his death, and that's why Johnson is now getting involved when he's president. These things have to be addressed now. Otherwise, it kind of delegitimizes everything the United States is working for in kind of a international sense, right? So Johnson pushes for this idea of this better American society, the Great Society, as he calls it. He wants to kind of do things like FDR did during the Great Depression, use the government to fix a lot of these problems. He starts with the Civil Rights Act, and now he's going to push for a thing called the Voting Rights Act to make sure that African Americans in the South, heck, everywhere, have a right to vote. And once again, it'll be the United States government that makes sure that local governments are following the law and adhering to true equality when it comes to voting. The United States government is going to be the overseer of all of this. And it actually works, right? By civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King bringing to the public view these realities of life for Black Southerners, people like Johnson have to do something about it. And with the federal government's help, people in the South, Black Southerners, are actually able to start participating. They're going to be able to actually change a lot of things in the South. Black participation in the South goes from 20% in 1960 to 62% 10 years later. So it is possible to really bring change. Just like the Roosevelt's New Deal brings change in the United States in the 1930s, so does LBJ's Great Society program. And what's really important here is the Great Society program isn't just about civil rights. It's about a whole bunch of things, right? It's about immigration. For LBJ, we need to stop those limitations that we did 40 years earlier in the 1920s on people coming into the United States. The United States needs to be seen as an asylum, a place for people to run to for help with their fleeing communism. So we open our doors again. We see people from all over Asia and Latin America come flooding into the country as their countries kind of become unstable, as they're torn apart in this Cold War. So that's one part of his Great Society. Another is the fact that for 100 years now, Americans have been talking about making sure people have access to medical attention, medical care. But a lot of people, especially elderly people, just couldn't afford it anymore. So now, again, the government's going to step in. Johnson creates a new agency of the federal government, the Medicare, Medicaid, and it's going to be a program that offers medical care to the elderly, the poor, disabled, right, children that need help. The government's going to be there for you. For Johnson, it's kind of a war on poverty, right? Help poor people. He's seen what it's like to be poor. He knows what effect it has, and he thinks it looks bad. The United States, the richest, most powerful country in the world, still has about 1 out of 5 Americans living in poverty, right? And heck, most of them are actually white people, right? So for Johnson, this seems kind of like a no-brainer. This should be easy to do. A lot of people that vote, a lot of people in the Democratic and Republican Party have members, people that vote for them that are poor and could be helped by these programs. So he finds a lot of support. And again, I'm going to hit you with a lot of different agencies here, but I just want you to kind of see Johnson is doing a lot of what FDR did during the Great Depression, try to take on vast amounts of parts of the American economy, American society, and try to find help, right? As this picture in the upper right-hand corner shows, there are a lot of Americans that still don't have indoor plumbing in the 1950s and 60s. There are parts of Appalachia, western or eastern Kentucky, Western Virginia, the state of West Virginia, where they don't have electricity sometimes, right? So in a country that's rich and powerful, those are pretty stark images when people have to go outside to wash their hair like these kids do. And it's not just that they need water and power, right? People need housing, right? They're in the richest country in the world. A lot of people can't afford those suburban homes that are being built all over the place. Cities are becoming very expensive to live in. The poor don't have any place to live. So that's when you start seeing rent control. That's when you start seeing Americans starting to go around and volunteer in other parts of the country under VISTA, right? Go out and help people in poor regions in the United States, in poor countries outside the United States. It's during this time that you start seeing Pell Grants from the federal government. Try to give poor people a chance to get a higher education, go to college. That way they'll get better jobs and they won't need government help anymore. And it's also when you see the start of a minimum wage. Now, we had done that during World War II and World War I, but they were only wartime programs. Now the federal government is going to step in and say all employers have to give a minimum wage. All right? It was $1.25 an hour in 1966. It moved up to $7.25 an hour in 2007. So kind of stop and think about that. It really hadn't moved a whole lot in almost 50 years' time. Still isn't very high federally at this time. Most states have a higher minimum wage than the federal government does at this time. But still, the federal government is getting in here saying there has to be a floor. You have to do at least this much. And in the end, it really does help. The poverty rate in this country does drop dramatically by the United States government spending on all these different programs. Poverty's cut almost in half, from 20% to about 13%. For Black Americans, this is a huge change, right? Black poverty rates drop by 50%. But it's expensive. And when you look at the cost of the Vietnam War, which is somewhere around $22 billion a year, the United States government is starting to spend a lot of money that it actually doesn't have. This is when you start seeing deficit spending starting to become a normal practice in the American government. So there are a lot of issues here that Johnson's not addressing, but he is trying to kind of push the country in the right direction, if you will. And of course, he kind of needs to. There's a pushback happening here in the 1960s. The civil rights movement is part of that pushback, right? This counterculture that actually starts in the 1950s when a lot of people say, I don't want to be a part of this conformist culture. I want to be an individual. I want to be outside the group, the herd, if you will, right? Well, that's actually gathering steam here in the 1960s because of the civil rights movement and because of the Vietnam War. And it really does kind of start as a response to the idea of conformity and this idea of these, this kind of hypocrisy on the part of the United States, where we say we're the nation of freedom and equality when all you have to do is look at what happened to Emmett Till and understand that that's not actually the truth for a large number of Americans, right? A lot of these young baby boomers, these kids that were born during World War II that are now starting to go to college, they're starting to get involved in the civil rights movement. They're inspired by people like Martin Luther King to try and change these things. They're on college campuses saying, hey, look, we have a right to kind of have a say in how these colleges are run because we're the ones going here. We're the ones helping pay for this. We want to take the classes we want. We want to have professors that talk about these things that matter to us. So that's what the free speech movement is that starts kind of in 1960 in Berkeley in California. And it starts sweeping college campuses everywhere. College kids start going on freedom rides, trying to challenge segregation laws, getting attacked like this young man in the picture in the lower right-hand corner. When he's from one of these northern universities, I think he went to Yale. He gets on a bus sitting next to a black person to challenge these, these seating laws that these buses have. And when they get to the South, where these laws are actually still being enforced, people like him are dragged off the the bus and beaten. He's going to spend 2 days in the hospital recovering from his wounds. And that is to say that this counterculture starts building up, kind of pushing back against all these kind of problems in American society. And these young kids start saying, look, it's not enough to just go and protest. It's not enough to just kind of demand action. You have to organize yourself. They start creating organizations like the Students for a Democratic Society, started by 2 young college students, Tom Hayden and Al Harbour, right? They start saying, look, this conformist culture of the 1950s is keeping us from really looking at these problems. They put out a statement in 1962 called the Port Huron Statement outside of Detroit, Michigan, where they say, look, things are not good here in the United States, right? We kind of see ourselves as hypocrites as a nation. And part of their statement kind of said this: we are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit. The permeating and victimizing fact of human degradation, symbolized by the Southern struggle against racial bigotry, compelled most of us from silence to activism. So what they're saying is, hey, we're these middle-class kids. We've grown up pretty nice lives in our suburban world, right? Our parents have cars. They've had good jobs. We've never known what it's like to be hungry or, be economically insecure. Now we're going off to universities. We're seeing how the world really is. We're not just watching TV anymore, and we're kind of scared about what we're seeing. Now that we're getting to see the world as it really is, we're noticing things like segregation. We're noticing things like lynchings, right? We want to stop all of that. We feel we have to do something. And then they go on to say this: second, the enclosing fact of the Cold War, symbolized by the presence of the bomb, brought awareness that we ourselves and our friends and millions of abstract others might die at any time. So now they're saying, look, we understand that there's this international problem going on, but the idea is that we're being told by the government all of our lives that at any minute the world could blow up. So if we have problems, we can't wait to fix them. We have to take care of them now, or else it might all be gone tomorrow, right? So there's kind of a sense of an immediacy here, that these things have to be done right now, today. And then comes the big part, right? We began to see complicated and disturbing paradoxes in our surrounding America. The declaration, all men are created equal, rang hollow before the facts of Negro life in the South and the big cities of the North. The proclaimed peaceful intentions of the United States contradicted its economic and military investment in the Cold War status quo. So what they're saying is the United States seems to be kind of hypocritical here, right? We talk about freedom on one hand, but yet a lot of Americans don't have freedom. We talk about defending a lot of people, yet we're the ones attacking people, like in places like North Vietnam. So for a lot of these kids, they kind of see things as not being the way that they want to see the world. And their version of America, the way they want to see America, is very different than older Americans, especially that World War II generation. Their parents, right? They don't think their parents are doing what they should be doing. So what we see is kind of a split here. A generational divide is starting to emerge, and you see it in things like the Port Huron Statement. Young people want things to be changed and changed now. They don't want to wait. They're willing to criticize the government. They're willing to push back against what's going on in the country, where older Americans are taking a more gradual approach, saying, hey, look, things are getting better. Let things play out. They'll get better as they go along. Don't cause too many problems. It makes us look bad, right? And then it makes it harder to actually make these changes. So, of course, that's not the message a lot of young people want to hear. They're going to start saying we need to get involved in politics. We need to start pushing the government to do more, to fix more of these problems. So you kind of see Johnson has to respond here, right? Johnson has to do something, or he risks kind of letting these more radical voices start taking over and start pushing the country maybe in a more dangerous path, a more controversial, a more confrontational relationship between Americans, both old and young and poor and rich, all of those kind of divides that have always been here in our country. So what we kind of notice is the one thing that really seems to bring a lot of young people together, right? Besides kind of opposing racism and kind of these Jim Crow realities of America, of course, is the Vietnam War. For a lot of Americans, young Americans, they just didn't see this war as being their war. It wasn't like World War II, where the United States was defending itself, was liberating other countries. To them, it seemed a lot more muddled than that. It was a lot harder to see exactly what the United States was doing. The governments we were supporting in South Vietnam were doing things like executing people in the streets, not the things that we said we were about. And of course, a lot of these young people didn't want to go fight in that war. They found a way out because the United States was pushing for more education, because the United States wanted to see the United States catch up technologically, at least as far as missiles and space technology with the Soviet Union. We made a lot of exemptions for kids to go to college. If you go to college, you can avoid the draft. So a lot of middle class and upper class Americans go to college. They can avoid the Vietnam War. Young people that are poor, of course, they have to go to war, and they resent that. So now there's a lot of divides here, right? Some people are being asked to fight. Some people are able to avoid that fight, right? And of course, a lot of these people going to college say, look, we don't want anybody to go to war. So they start protesting the war in general. Not only that they don't want to go fight, they don't want to send anybody else. They start pushing for the government to stop. And they get a lot of support from their generation that's in the music industry, right? Groups like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, folk singers like Joan Baez. They put out songs all the time telling people, don't fight, right? Just concentrate on yourselves, concentrate on your life, right? Don't tell other people how to do things. So over and over again, this growth of protesting the war becomes the kind of focal point on a lot of American campuses and for a lot of American young people. Sometimes there can be crowds of 10 to 100,000 people marching in big cities in the United States, protesting the war, saying, let's get out now. Let's stop it. So here in 1960s America, this country is radically dividing itself, both on racial issues, on class issues, and now on international issues, right? It is getting harder and harder to find common ground. And even in sports, that is starting to happen. One guy, his name is Cassius Clay. In the 1960 Olympics, he wins a gold medal for the United States in Italy. Well, by 1966, he is the heavyweight champion in boxing in the United States of the world, right? So he is one of the foremost sports figures in the world. He is a flamboyant figure. He's a great interview. People love to put him on TV because he's very charismatic. But in 1966, something happens. His draft number comes up. The United States government forces people to go into the military, whether they like it or not, unless they go to college. Well, Muhammad Ali, being a boxer, is definitely not going to college because his job is boxing. But that is not exempt from military draft. And what makes this all more confusing and kind of difficult to follow is Muhammad Ali is born Cassius Clay. That's his name he's born with in Kentucky. But in the 1960s, he decides to change his name to Muhammad Ali. He is converted to another religion. He was born Protestant, a Baptist, but he decides to become a Islamic, all right? He becomes a Muslim, right? And he says that religion is more indicative to his racial ideas, right? He says because he's been seen as different, he's going to take on a religion that is something that's used by black and brown people, right? That's their religion, so to speak, right? Protestantism is a white religion. He's going to use Islam because that's more of a brown or a black religion. And then comes the day he's supposed to go and join the U.S. military. And he says in a very public interview, he says, look, my conscience won't let me go shoot my brother. He says, I'm not going to serve. If you're going to make me serve, put me in jail because I refuse to join the military. And he says, look, I just can't do it. He says, I don't want to shoot my brother, black people like me. I don't want to shoot darker people, right, brown people, or some poor hungry person in the mud for big, powerful America. And he says, and shoot them for what? He said, those people that you want me to go fight never called me the N-word. They never lynched me. They didn't put dogs on me. They didn't rob me of my nationality, rape and kill my mother and father. Shoot them for what? How can I shoot them poor people? Just take me to jail. Well, that's exactly what happens. When he refuses to serve, right, when he refuses to join the military, he's put in jail. He's stripped of his titles, he loses a lot of money, and he spends about a year and a half in jail before he can get out and resume his boxing career. But for a lot of young people, he's inspirational. He stands up and he opposes what's going on here. He calls out the United States government. He calls out this hypocrisy, saying, look, at the United States supported slavery. The United States supported Jim Crow. The United States is allowing things like lynchings to still take place, right? And they're not fixing it. So why should I fight for that country? For a lot of young people, that makes sense. For a lot of older Americans, it seems ungrateful. Here he is. He's been able to have a great career. He's been able to have a great life. He may not have been able to do that in other places. So for a lot of older Americans, they think that this guy just doesn't get it, the cost and the sacrifice that everybody has to bear. So you can kind of see this divide growing and growing. For older Americans, Muhammad Ali is seen as ungrateful and is kind of a villain. For younger people, he's an inspirational figure and he's a leader, right? And this is kind of happening in not just kind of racial issues, but even all kinds of issues around the war. Celebrities are out protesting the war. In the upper left-hand corner, this is an actress, Jane Fonda. She goes and visits the troops during the Vietnam War. The only problem is she visits North Vietnamese troops. She doesn't go and visit American troops fighting North Vietnam. She goes and visits North Vietnam and apologizes for the United States attacking them. She's seen as a traitor by older Americans, right? Siding with the enemy. Younger Americans love it, right? They think she's standing up for herself, speaking her mind, being independent, nonconformist. Another person down in the lower right-hand corner. This one's a veteran, right? He was in college in the early 1960s, decided to quit and join the war because he thought it was unfair that some people fought and others didn't. When he joins, he goes into the Navy, becomes an officer because he's smart and goes to college and is connected, has a wealthy family. And he becomes a hero in Vietnam, gets all kinds of medals. But when he comes home from the war, he goes and testifies in front of Congress and says, I don't know what we're doing there. We're not going to win this war. We shouldn't be there in the first place. Let's get out. He becomes a hero to a lot of younger people that are opposing the war, saying it's a stupid war. It's dumb to ask people like John Kerry, this serviceman down here in the lower corner, to go and fight. Older Americans see him as, again, kind of a traitor, right? He's supposed to defend the country. He's going against the government, against what he and other soldiers have been fighting for. So they kind of see him as being a bit of a traitor. Both of these actions that these people take, Jane Fonda, the actress, and John Kerry, the serviceman going to be a politician, these things are going to come back to haunt them. Jane Fonda's career is going to be ruined in the 1970s because she's seen as a bit of a traitor, of taking the enemy's side. John Kerry, when he runs for president in 2004, he's going to be attacked by a lot of people because of his stance against the Vietnam War 30 years earlier. So these are going to be deep divides that are going to affect people's lives, not just here in the 1960s, but really for the next 20, 30 years. An entire generation of Americans are going to be bitterly divided over all of these things we're looking at, right? One other thing I want to kind of talk about, and it'll take a couple minutes to get through this, but the last thing we want to kind of talk about here is the fact that this counterculture starts growing in a lot of kind of different ways, if you will look at it, right? It goes beyond just kind of politics and kind of racial issues in this country. This nonconformity starts really kind of tearing at the fabric of America. And you can see it in a couple of distinct and stark ways. One is that a lot of young Americans here in the 1960s start turning to drugs, right? It's kind of popularized in their music and rock and roll music. It's shown in movies, but it's also being taught in universities. One Harvard psychology professor, a guy by the name of Timothy Leary in the 1960s, actually is telling his psychology students in class, go ahead and take drugs. It's good for you. Right now, it's ludicrous. It's silly. It's dangerous, but he does it. He tells his students, start taking drugs, right? Listen to this anti-war message, listen to this nonconformist message that's out there in music, and drop out of college, right? That's his message to a lot of people, right? He tells them to take drugs like LSD, a very dangerous psychokinetic drug, right? It's very dangerous for you, but he's telling you to take it. And a lot of young people here in the 1960s are pushing back against this idea of what it means to be an American, what you're supposed to do. They don't want to get married and have kids. They don't want to get a job and go to work for some big corporation. They much rather have a much looser lifestyle. Places like San Francisco, the Haight-Ashbury district, kind of become the centers of these bohemian lifestyles, as they're sometimes called, where they start listening to these rock and roll bands like in the Grateful Dead in the Bay Area, where you're kind of told you can have sex with whoever you want. You don't have to get married. You don't have to have kids, right? Very much the opposite of that conformist message that was hit as you're growing up in the 1950s and here in the 1960s, that you don't have to have a car and a house. You can just rent an apartment with a bunch of your friends and just hang out. So all through the 1960s, this kind of nonconformist lifestyle is starting to build up and gain popularity. But it sometimes comes at a big cost. It's tough to kind of undo 20 years of conformity, right? One person in particular is going to find this out the hard way. His name is Jose Feliciano. You may know this guy as the person that wrote the Christmas song Feliz Navidad, right? That's actually what he's famous for. But before that, he's a big up-and-coming musical person in the United States, right? He's a young musician. He is blind, but he plays a great guitar. He's kind of a folksy kind of sound to it that's got some Latin kind of flair to it, but it's still kind of a very much a pop sound. It's becoming very popular. In 1968, he's asked to play before a baseball game in Tiger Stadium in Detroit, and he plays the national anthem. But he plays it differently. It's not like a big band or a school marching band version. It kind of has a bit of a Hispanic flair to it. He's from California. He is Hispanic. So he kind of plays it the way he wants to play it. He wants to show that individuality. Well, the people in Detroit can't stand it. They decide that he's not singing it the right way. He's using the wrong music. It sounds different than what they like. And they demand that he be thrown out of Detroit, right? His music career is destroyed because of this performance, because it goes out on the TV. People call out in the TV stations that show this thing and say, how dare they put somebody on TV that disrespects the nation, right? He loses his career for several years. It is that Christmas song that actually saves what little music career he has left in the early 1970s. So this stuff has real ramifications for people. If you're caught on the wrong side, you can lose everything. Now, what's amazing is another musician does kind of the same thing. His name's Jimi Hendrix. He's actually a former soldier, fought in Vietnam, comes home, joins the music scene, becomes an anti-war protester, right? And then plays at a music festival called Woodstock. He plays a horrible version of the Star-Spangled Banner, because that's what he thinks America means to him right then, right? That it's messed up, that it's messy, it's not doing the right thing, so he plays the national anthem like that. And his career skyrockets because he's playing to young people. Jose Feliciano is playing to the public, the older Americans that are watching baseball games. So very much this divide in America is very, very present here, right? It's very easy to see in these terms. And you can even see it in other public figures. John Lennon, a member of the Beatles, is one of the most famous musicians in the entire world. But he takes on this anti-war protest with his girlfriend, Yoko Ono, eventually his wife. They say they're not going to leave their bed until the war ends, right? So he's not going to write any music. He's not going to perform until there's peace in the world, right? So there's a lot of people pushing back against what it's expected, what's right, what you're supposed to be doing as a person in the world, in the United States here in the 1960s. In a very real way, this country is bitterly divided in the 1960s. And it even shows up in this moment, right? In 1969, we actually fulfill Kennedy's call to put a man on the moon. The United States launches Apollo 11, and we put 2 astronauts on the face of the moon, something that human beings have been dreaming about doing for thousands upon thousands of years. Well, we finally accomplish it. The United States proves that it can do things that no other country to this day has been able to do. And for about 3 weeks in the summer of 1969, Americans come together, old and young, protesters and non-protesters, black and white, to marvel at this achievement that their country has been able to do. And then they go right back to fighting as soon as the astronauts are home, right? All those divisions are just too deep. Even this moment can't bring the country together. So what we see here in 1960s is kind of a breakdown, if you will, right? This country's breaking down in a lot of ways. And what we're really going to notice is when Johnson can't run for re-election in 1968, the whole country kind of falls apart politically, especially the left, right? The New Deal coalition of white Southerners, white Northerners, African Americans, and other minorities is slowly disintegrating here in the 1960s. Young people want a government that's more active, listening to them on these international issues. African Americans are still calling for more equality, more real change in the country, right? I mean, it's 14, 15 years after Brown versus Board, and there are still segregated schools in the United States. So there's a lot of people that are unhappy with the way things are going. And a lot of conservatives in the country are feeling, hey, look, we haven't been listened to for decades now. We want to kind of bring all this madness to a close, put the country back on what they consider to be the right footing. So there's a lot breaking down here in the 1960s, and we'll kind of take a look at this breakdown that really happens in the late 60s and into the 1970s when we look at a thing called the Nixon administration. Nixon emerges in 1968, comes back out of political oblivion, and kind of takes the government, gets back into the government, becomes the president of the United States, and now he's the one that's going to have to deal with all these issues like the war in Vietnam, bringing this country together. What are we going to do about these Great Society programs? Are we going to keep doing them or are we not? How are we going to deal with the Cold War? Well, that's going to be Nixon's choices here, and that's what we'll look at next time. All right? Thank you guys very much.